Hey friends, and welcome to Medieval Screen Finds. Tonight, we invite you to journey with us into a lesser-known, yet profoundly impactful, corner of the past, one shaped by the brutal and often indiscriminate actions of mercenary companies. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always intriguing to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps light an incense or two for that soothing fragrance. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our focus this evening will be on these formidable and frequently feared groups of paid soldiers. We'll dive into their origins, understanding the historical currents that gave rise to their formidable presence on the battlefields and in the villages of medieval Europe. We will explore their operational methods, how they fought, and how they sustained themselves, often through means that left widespread destruction in their wake. And most importantly, we will contemplate the devastating impact these companies had on the lives of ordinary people, on the very fabric of medieval society, and on the enduring legacy of warfare itself. This is a story not of grand battles and heroic last stands, but of the quiet, pervasive terror that settled over countryside when a black company was rumored to be near. Prepare to embark on a journey through a fascinating chapter of our shared past. In the tapestry of medieval Europe, where feudal allegiances wove the social and military fabric, a profound shift began to unfold, subtly at first, then with increasing momentum. This transformation would give rise to a new, formidable, and often terrifying force, the mercenary company. To truly understand these black companies, as they often came to be known, we must first set the historical stage, exploring the intricate conditions that fostered their proliferation across the continent. The traditional bedrock of medieval warfare had long been the feudal levy. Picture a lord issuing a summons to his vassals, who, in turn, called upon their own knights and peasants to fulfill their military obligations. It was a system rooted in loyalty and landholding, a reciprocal agreement where military service was owed in exchange for protection and sustenance. For centuries, this model largely sufficed, its rhythms dictated by the seasons of agricultural life and the localized nature of conflict. However, as the High Middle Ages gave way to the Late Middle Ages, the limitations of this system became increasingly apparent, like cracks appearing in an ancient foundation. One of the most significant issues was the inherent unreliability of feudal armies. Their service was often brief, typically limited to a certain number of days per year, after which knights and levies would simply return to their estates and fields. This short service made sustained campaigns, particularly lengthy sieges or distant expeditions, exceedingly difficult. Moreover, the quality of training varied wildly. While knights were formidable in their own right, the peasant levies often lacked the specialized skills and rigorous discipline required for increasingly complex warfare. Loyalty, too, could be a fickle thing, often shifting with personal allegiances and the vagaries of local politics, rather than a unified national cause. Simultaneously, the nature of warfare itself was undergoing a quiet, yet profound, evolution. As kings and powerful nobles consolidated their authority, they harbored grander ambitions to expand their territories, secure their borders, and assert their dominance on a larger stage. These ambitious campaigns demanded forces that were more reliable, more professional, and more readily available than the traditional feudal levies could provide. A king embarking on a protracted war against a rival monarch needed soldiers who would remain in the field, year-round if necessary, not simply for customary 40 days. Adding another layer to this changing landscape were the advancements in military technology. Siege warfare, for instance, was becoming increasingly sophisticated, requiring specialized engineers, sappers, and a greater understanding of fortifications. New weapons, such as the crossbow and the longbow, gained prominence, demanding skilled practitioners who had dedicated years to mastering their craft. These were not skills easily acquired by part-time soldiers. The highly effective Welsh longbowmen, for example, were not simply peasants with bows. They were professional archers whose prowess was honed through constant practice and generations of tradition. The Swiss Pikemen, too, would emerge as a testament to the power of specialized, professional infantry. It was within this shifting military paradigm that the economic and social realities of medieval life converged to create a fertile ground for mercenary recruitment. For many, life in the medieval period was a constant struggle, marked by the ever-present shadow of poverty and dispossession. The land, though fertile, often yielded just enough to survive, and a bad harvest, a local conflict, or a lord's whim could plunge entire families into destitution. Peasants, tied to the land, had little recourse when their crops failed or their villages were plundered. For landless knights, younger sons with no inheritance, and discharged soldiers with no other skills, the options for livelihood were starkly limited. In this landscape of scarcity, the life of a paid soldier, a mercenary, glittered with the alluring promise of wealth and plunder. It was a world where a man, by virtue of his strength and skill with a weapon, could potentially escape the grinding poverty that was the lot of so many. The prospect of regular pay, though often irregular in practice, was a powerful draw, a stark contrast to the precarious existence of peasant life. Beyond wages, there was the tantalizing lure of loot, the spoils of war, ranging from coinage and valuables to livestock and foodstuffs. For some, it was the chance to acquire a ransom from a captured noble, a single act that could provide enough wealth to transform their fortunes entirely. For others, mercenary service was simply one of the few avenues available for survival, let alone any hope of social mobility. The structured, albeit brutal, hierarchy of a mercenary company offered a sense of belonging and purpose that was often absent in a fragmented society. The origins of these mercenary groups were as varied as the men who filled their ranks. Often, they emerged from the aftermath of wars, when large numbers of soldiers, no longer needed by their former employers, found themselves unemployed and adrift. With military skills as their only real asset, and with little prospect of returning to a civilian life that no longer existed for them, they banded together, forming ad hoc companies to survive. These groups, initially perhaps small and desperate, would then seek new patrons, offering their swords for hire to the highest bidder. Foreign recruits also played a crucial role in the mercenary phenomenon. Different regions developed unique military specializations, making their fighters highly sought after. Welsh longbowmen, with their unmatched archery skills, were prized additions to English armies. The formidable Swiss pikemen, known for their disciplined and unyielding formations, became the shock troops of choice for many European powers. German Landsknechts, with their distinctive attire and aggressive fighting style, would carve out a reputation for ferocity and effectiveness across the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. These foreign recruits often brought with them not only specialized skills but also a certain detachment from local allegiances, making them ideal instruments for distant conflicts. A pivotal catalyst in the widespread proliferation and entrenchment of mercenary companies was the 100 Years' War. This prolonged, intermittent conflict between England and France, spanning over a century, created an insatiable demand for professional soldiers. Both sides extensively employed mercenaries, feeding the growth of these independent companies and integrating them deeply into the military landscape. Truces, rather than bringing peace, often unleashed these forces upon the land, as unpaid or disbanded mercenaries simply continued to live off the countryside, transforming from hired soldiers into dreaded free companies. The business of war, for these companies, became surprisingly sophisticated, albeit ruthlessly so. Mercenary captains, often charismatic and shrewd individuals, would negotiate detailed contracts with lords and monarchs, outlining terms of service, duration, and, crucially, payment. These contracts often included provisions for significant upfront payments and, notoriously, the rights to plunder conquered territories. The lure of potential riches was a powerful incentive for both captain and soldier. Within the companies themselves, a structure emerged, albeit one often more fluid than that of a traditional army. At the top was the captain, the leader who secured contracts and commanded the company. Beneath him were lieutenants and sergeants, managing the various units, down to the rank-and-file soldiers, each armed according to their specialty and means. The bonds that held these companies together were primarily economic and pragmatic. Shared danger, the promise of gain, and the grim necessity of survival. Unlike feudal levies, who often fought for their lord and their homeland, the mercenaries' primary loyalty was to their paymaster and, more deeply, to their company. This lack of national or ideological allegiance often contributed directly to their ruthlessness. Without patriotic or moral constraints, their actions were often dictated purely by expediency and the pursuit of profit. The initial impact of these nascent mercenary companies on civilian populations was, to put it mildly, deeply unsettling. Even in their early forms, instances of pillaging and extortion were not uncommon, particularly when campaigns ended abruptly or when payment was delayed. Soldiers, left without income, would simply take what they needed from the local populace. However, it was the emergence of the large, independent free companies during truces or after major wars that truly unleashed a new level of terror. These were not armies fighting for a specific cause, but self-sustaining entities whose continued existence depended on living off the land, extracting resources through any means necessary. They were a harbinger of the devastation that would come to define the black companies in the years that followed, leaving scars of fortune that would forever alter the landscape of medieval Europe. As the medieval sun rose and set, painting the vast European landscape in hues of gold and shadow, another, far more ominous shade began to spread across the land. The dark stain left by the operational methods of the mercenary companies. These were not simply armies fighting for a cause or loyal instruments of a sovereign. They were often self-sustaining entities whose very existence depended on their ability to extract resources from the territories they occupied or traversed, and they did so with a chilling and systematic disregard for conventional warfare ethics, and indeed, for basic human decency. Their impact on civilian populations was direct, devastating, and often remembered in hushed, fearful tones for generations, etched into the collective memory of the populace. One of the most insidious and effective tactics systematically employed by these companies was the scorched earth policy. Imagine, if you will, vast, fertile fields of ripening grain, shimmering gold under the summer sun, the very sustenance of an entire community, deliberately and methodically put to the torch. Picture ancient olive groves, tended for centuries, reduced to smoldering, lifeless husks. Envision villages, once bustling with life and the comforting sounds of daily toil, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the murmur of prayers from the church, the laughter of children, now standing silent, their timber homes reduced to heaps of ash and their stone walls blackened ruins. This was not random, wanton destruction born of uncontrolled rage. It was a calculated and cold-blooded strategy, a tactical choice executed with grim efficiency. By systematically destroying crops, seizing or slaughtering livestock, contaminating wells, and razing infrastructure, the mercenaries achieved multiple, brutal objectives. They denied vital resources to their enemies, certainly, preventing opposing armies from living off the land or resupplying. But, more fundamentally and far more devastatingly, they instilled a profound, paralyzing, and utterly demoralizing fear in the populace. The psychological impact of seeing one's entire livelihood, one's ancestral home, and the very foundation of one's existence deliberately annihilated was immense. This act often stripped communities of their will to resist, forcing them into immediate and desperate submission, leaving them with no option but to flee or to yield to the mercenaries' demands. The lingering smell of smoke and the sight of desolation became grim monuments to their passage. Beyond outright destruction, extortion became a systematic, highly organized, and incredibly profitable practice. Towns and villages, desperate to avoid the fate of their less fortunate neighbors, those whose lands lay smoldering, would be approached by mercenary captains with grim propositions that were less negotiations and more thinly veiled threats. "Pay us," they would demand, their voices devoid of empathy, "and we will spare your lives, your homes, your harvest, your precious children." These payments, often exorbitant and financially crippling, were frequently referred to as ransoms, a grim and cynical parody of the noble tradition of ransoming captured knights, twisting a chivalric custom into a tool of terror against the defenseless. Sometimes, these demands came in the form of burning letters or letters of protection, official-looking, sealed documents, sometimes even adorned with the captain's own coat of arms, that served as an elaborate protection racket. These documents, paid for dearly, guaranteed a community's safety and immunity from plunder in exchange for regular, often crippling, tribute. The choice for civilians was a stark and agonizing one, between utter ruin and an impoverishing, yet perhaps life-saving, payment that mortgaged their future. This systematic extraction of wealth effectively turned entire regions into unwilling financiers of the very forces that terrorized them, caught in a perpetual cycle of fear and payment. The focus of these companies was often, strategically and ruthlessly, on unprotected and vulnerable populations. Unlike traditional armies, which might seek decisive engagements with opposing military forces on a designated battlefield, mercenaries frequently targeted isolated villages, unwalled towns, and undefended agricultural areas. These offered easy plunder and faced little organized resistance. A fortified castle, its stone walls soaring, or a well-defended city, with its vigilant garrisons, presented a challenging obstacle, requiring costly sieges and risking heavy casualties. In stark contrast, an isolated peasant village or an unwalled market town was an open invitation to wealth and the satisfaction of baser desires, offering minimal risk for maximum reward. This predatory approach further highlighted their detachment from any traditional military code of conduct or the chivalric ideals often romanticized in the era. Their efficiency lay not in grand strategy, but in systematic, opportunistic exploitation. Pillage and plunder were not mere side effects of mercenary operations, accidental occurrences in the chaos of war. They were often central to their policy, a core motivator for their recruitment, and a fundamental component of their financial model. The organized and systematic seizure of valuables, livestock, cattle, sheep, horses, foodstuffs, grain, cured meats, wine, and anything of material worth from conquered or occupied territories was a methodical process, meticulously planned and executed. Companies could strip an area bare with chilling efficiency and brutal speed, leaving widespread famine and utter destitution in their wake. Imagine the profound silence that descended upon a village after a company had passed through. The empty barns, the absence of animals, the stark, chilling reality of survival now resting on bare hands, empty fields, and the desperate search for what little might have been overlooked. For the individual soldiers, the prospect of booty was a significant and tangible motivator, supplementing their often irregular and delayed pay, and providing a direct, often immediate, reward for their harsh and dangerous existence. Captains even used the promise of plunder as a way to control and incentivize their troops, allowing certain excesses as a reward for loyalty or success. The methods of destruction employed by these companies were comprehensive and designed to leave a lasting, traumatic impact, ensuring that the memory of their passage would linger. Arson was rampant, with fire used indiscriminately to destroy residential buildings, productive farms, vital mills, and entire settlements. The terrifying glow of distant fires against the night sky would have been a terrifying beacon on the horizon for those lucky enough to have escaped, a stark, fiery reminder of the fate that had befallen their neighbors and perhaps awaited them. Vandalism, the senseless destruction of property, was also widespread, often carried out for no strategic gain but simply out of malice, a desire to terrorize, or complete lack of discipline. Imagine a village church, its sacred stained glass windows shattered into countless shards, its altar defiled, its holy relics scattered, not for any military advantage, but simply as an act of contempt, a demonstration of their absolute power. Even churches, monasteries, and religious sites, traditionally considered sacrosanct, were not spared. They were frequently attacked for their valuable relics, precious ornaments, stored wealth, or even as a symbolic act to undermine the morale and spiritual authority of the local community and the church itself. Perhaps the most horrific and enduring aspect of their operations was the widespread and unpunished violence against civilians. The reality of sexual violence committed by mercenary soldiers against women in occupied territories was pervasive, brutal, and utterly dehumanizing. It was often used as a weapon of war, a means of terrorizing populations, breaking their spirit, and a horrific expression of dominance over the conquered. Massacres and summary executions were also disturbingly common, with civilians often killed without cause, simply to terrorize populations into submission, to eliminate any potential, however small, for future resistance, or often, out of sheer bloodlust and a complete devaluation of human life. Torture was employed, not just to extract information about hidden valuables or the whereabouts of local leaders, but, disturbingly, often simply for sadistic pleasure, a testament to the moral depravity that can accompany unchecked power and violence. These acts of violence were not isolated incidents, regrettable aberrations. They formed a grim, consistent pattern, painting a chilling picture of daily life under the oppressive shadow of a mercenary occupation. A pervasive theme in the contemporary accounts of these companies is their general lack of discipline and accountability. Even their nominal employers, the kings and lords who hired them, often found it exceedingly difficult to control these highly independent and often unruly mercenary forces once unleashed. This inherent lack of control frequently led to widespread and often random acts of violence that defied any strategic logic. It was a chilling paradox that masonry companies were often as feared, if not more so, by the populations they were supposedly protecting as they were by the enemy they were hired to fight. This widespread fear was not unfounded, as victims of mercenary atrocities found themselves with virtually no legal recourse. These companies largely operated outside established legal frameworks, answerable only to their captains, and often not even to them. Justice was a concept that simply ceased to exist, replaced by brutal expediency, when a black company arrived. History provides us with chilling and specific examples of these notorious black companies. During the 100 Years' War, The French countryside was ravaged by the so-called Great Companies, such as the infamous Tardvinus or the Routiers. These large, independent groups emerged during truces, their continued existence dependent entirely on pillaging and extortion, leaving behind a trail of famine and depopulation so severe that it took generations for some regions to recover. The Catalan Company, initially formed by the ambitious Roger de Flor, unleashed a brutal campaign of plunder and destruction in Greece and Byzantine territories after de Flor's assassination, a testament to their ruthlessness when betrayed or unpaid. They even managed to establish independent political entities, creating the Duchy of Athens and Neopatras, demonstrating their capacity for more than just fleeting violence. These are but a few of the grim illustrations of the operational methods that earned these companies their dark and enduring reputation, forever scarring the landscape and the memory of medieval Europe, and serving as a stark warning about the unchecked power of professionalized violence. The passing of a mercenary company was not merely a momentary tremor in the otherwise steady rhythm of medieval life. It was a cataclysm that cast a long, enduring shadow over society, leaving behind profound and often irreparable consequences that rippled through generations. Beyond the immediate violence and plunder, the prolonged and pervasive presence of these black companies inflicted deep and festering wounds on the economic fabric of regions, fractured social cohesion, ignited widespread political instability, and etched a pervasive psychological trauma upon the civilian populace, the echoes of which would persist for decades, if not centuries. The very essence of what it meant to live in peace and security was profoundly undermined. The economic devastation wrought by mercenaries was far-reaching, comprehensive, and often led to widespread ruin that crippled entire regions. At its core was agricultural ruin, the very foundation of medieval sustenance. Imagine vast, fertile field that had sustained families for generations, now trampled into muddy waste, deliberately burned to ashes, or simply left fallow and untended because the people who tilled them had either fled in terror or been cruelly killed. Livestock, the cows, sheep, pigs, and horses that were the lifeblood of rural communities, providing food, labor, and wealth, were systematically seized or slaughtered indiscriminately, leading to an immediate and acute shortage of food and draft animals. This wanton destruction of crops, farms, and animals directly contributed to widespread famine and agricultural collapse in affected regions, often plunging them into starvation and economic despair. The delicate, finely balanced system of medieval subsistence farming, where communities lived hand-to-mouth based on the success of each harvest, was easily and irrevocably shattered by such depredations. Trade, the circulatory system of the medieval economy, also suffered immensely indirectly. The pervasive insecurity that spread across the countryside, often encompassing vast swathes of land, made established trade routes perilous. Merchants, fearing ambush, robbery, and the confiscation of their valuable goods, either ceased their vital activities altogether or were forced to seek circuitous, less efficient, and far more costly paths through supposedly safer territories. This disruption of overland routes meant that essential goods could not reach markets, and local products could not be sold elsewhere. Markets, once vibrant centers of exchange, bustling with activity, color, and the sounds of commerce, withered as the flow of goods was disrupted, and the ability to transport them safely became almost impossible. This fundamental breakdown in trade further isolated communities, exacerbating shortages of essential commodities and stifling any hope of economic recovery, pushing them deeper into self-sufficiency that often bordered on destitution. Perhaps one of the most visible, tangible, and heartbreaking impacts of mercenary activity was depopulation and the subsequent abandonment of once thriving settlements. Villages and even entire towns, once home to generations of thriving communities, were simply abandoned en masse as their populations fled the relentless predations of mercenary bands. People sought refuge wherever they could find it, in the perceived, though often temporary, safety of fortified cities, if they were fortunate enough to reach them before the gates closed, or by dispersing into the wilderness, hoping to survive unseen by the marauding companies. This mass exodus led to significant demographic shifts, leaving vast swathes of formerly productive agricultural land desolate, empty, and returning to wilderness. The demographic scars of mercenary passage could be seen for decades, if not longer, in the empty fields and the silent, crumbling ruins of once populated hamlets. Adding to this devastating burden was the enormous and unsustainable financial strain placed upon kingdoms, principalities, and individual lords. The cost of hiring and maintaining mercenary armies was staggering, often consuming a vast percentage of a ruler's annual income. Mercenaries demanded significant payments, not just for their service, but often for their equipment, their horses, and even for their wounded. Their unpredictable nature, compounded by their frequent demands for additional payments or the right to plunder, often meant that these costs could escalate unexpectedly and astronomically, plunging rulers deeper into debt. To fund these expensive forces, rulers were frequently forced to levy increased and oppressive taxation upon an already struggling populace, which further burdened ordinary people, leading to widespread resentment and even rebellion. This also contributed to rampant inflation, distorting markets and straining the entire economic system. It was a vicious and self-perpetuating cycle. The perceived need for mercenaries to counter other mercenaries, or to pursue ambitious, costly campaigns, led to severe economic hardship that, in turn, fueled the desperation that drove men to become mercenaries in the first place, ensuring a continuous supply of willing fighters. On a social level, the disruption caused by mercenary activity was equally profound, leaving deep and lasting trauma that affected the very fabric of society. The most immediate consequence was mass displacement, creating hundreds of thousands of internal refugees within their own lands. These desperate people fled their homes, abandoning everything they owned, seeking shelter wherever they could find it, often in overcrowded and unsanitary urban centers, or by simply abandoning established life to escape to safer, untouched regions, becoming wandering exiles. The breakdown of social order was rapid and brutal. In areas ravaged by mercenaries, the traditional structures of local governance, the rule of law, and social cohesion simply collapsed, leading to a state of near anarchy. Without the protection of a lord, the functioning of local courts, or the enforcement of laws, communities were left utterly vulnerable to any armed group that passed through. The psychological impact on survivors was immense. A pervasive and crippling sense of fear, a deep-seated distrust of outsiders, and a trauma that could haunt individuals and generations for decades, manifesting in anxiety, depression, and a shattered sense of security. The arbitrary violence, the constant threat of attack, and the profound uncertainty about the future left an indelible mark on the psyche of the populace. This pervasive climate of instability also led to a significant increase in local banditry and crime, as desperate individuals, often former peasants or disbanded soldiers with nothing left to lose, formed smaller groups to survive through similar means, further destabilizing the countryside and perpetuating the cycle of violence and lawlessness. Politically, the unchecked power and wanton destruction of mercenary companies chipped away at the very foundations of feudal authority and the nascent concept of centralized state power. The abject inability of kings, powerful feudal lords, and even the Holy Roman Emperor to protect their own populations from the ravages of these independent forces severely eroded their legitimacy and authority in the eyes of their subjects. If a ruler could not guarantee the basic safety and security of his people, what was the purpose of his rule? What was the meaning of allegiance? In some extreme and alarming cases, entire areas effectively came under the direct, de facto control of powerful mercenary captains, who operated as rogue states or territories entirely outside any traditional political framework, collecting taxes and administering justice as they saw fit. Lords, desperate to survive or to avoid conflict, were often forced into uneasy and humiliating alliances with powerful mercenary groups or compelled to pay protection money, further highlighting their weakened and compromised position. This phenomenon fundamentally shifted power dynamics within the medieval political landscape, as rulers were increasingly forced to contend with these independent military powers, whose allegiances were bought, not earned through traditional feudal bonds. This era was a testament to the fact that military power, when divorced from political legitimacy, could still profoundly shape the fate of nations. The demographic impact of prolonged mercenary activity was also significant and multifaceted. Beyond direct violence from massacres and executions, the indirect effects of widespread famine and disease, often exacerbated by the destruction of crops, the contamination of water sources, and the displacement of large populations into unsanitary conditions, led to significant reductions in overall population. The movement of people also led to dramatic changes in settlement patterns, with individuals gravitating towards more defensible, often urban, areas, seeking safety behind city walls, while countless rural settlements were simply abandoned, becoming ghost villages that slowly crumbled into the earth. Paradoxically, and perhaps ultimately beneficially, the widespread use and the unchecked excesses of mercenaries had profound long-term military and political consequences that, in time, led to their decline. The uncontrolled and utterly destructive power of these companies ultimately spurred the urgent need for emerging states to develop their own standing armies and more disciplined, loyal forces. Rulers, exasperated by the unreliability, disloyalty, and sheer destructiveness of mercenaries, began to recognize the paramount necessity of having military forces directly under their centralized control, marking a pivotal and decisive shift from the fragmented feudal system. This imperative led to a gradual but profound development of military professionalism, with an increasing emphasis on standardized training, rigorous discipline, a clear and unquestionable chain of command, and the institutionalization of military service within state armies. The anarchy and unbridled violence of the mercenary bands, by highlighting their inherent flaws, ultimately paved the way for more organized and state-controlled military power. This era also laid the nascent groundwork for the eventual development of what would become international law, with a growing, albeit slow, recognition of the need for some form of understanding, regulation, or control over military forces and their conduct, though this would take centuries to truly develop and implement. The Church, as the primary moral and spiritual authority of the age, was not silent in the face of this widespread suffering. It repeatedly appealed for peace and protection, often attempting to mediate conflicts and offering sanctuary in its monasteries and churches, though with limited success against the raw, unthinking power of the mercenaries. Furthermore, ecclesiastical condemnations of the brutal conduct of mercenaries were frequent, forceful, and issued from the highest levels of the Church. Yet, despite the moral outrage and spiritual threats, these condemnations often went unheeded by men who operated outside the bounds of conventional morality and who saw plunder and survival as their primary rewards. The shadow cast by these companies was indeed long and dark, shaping not only the immediate, desperate lives of medieval people, but also the very course of military, social, and political evolution, leaving an indelible scar on the tapestry of European history. To truly grasp the formidable and often terrifying reality of medieval mercenary companies, we must move beyond the broader strokes of their rise and impact and delve into specific historical examples. These case studies and the figures who led them provide concrete illustrations of their operational methods, the extent of their devastation, and their often surprising roles in shaping the course of history. During the protracted and devastating 100 Years' War, a conflict that intermittently bled France dry for over a century, the so-called Great Companies emerged as a relentless scourge upon the land. These large, independent companies were frequently comprised of soldiers left unemployed during periods of truce, or those whose contracts had simply expired, leaving them with no means of support other than their military skills. Instead of disbanding peacefully, they continued to live off the land, transforming from hired fighters into relentless predators. One such notorious group was the Tardvinus, a name that evokes a sense of creeping dread, meaning latecomers, or those who arrived late to the peace. This particular company was led by a figure known chillingly as the Archpriest, Honor de Serval, a man whose religious title stood in stark contrast to his brutal actions. Imagine the paralyzing terror that would spread through a village at the mere whisper of their approach, a name synonymous with impending ruin. These companies systematically ravaged the French countryside, methodically pillaging towns, indiscriminately destroying crops, and leaving widespread famine and depopulation in their wake, transforming fertile lands into barren wastes. The accounts from contemporary chroniclers, such as the renowned Jean Froissart, paint a vivid and often heartbreaking picture of the pervasive suffering endured by the common people at their hands, detailing the widespread destruction of livelihoods and the flight of refugees. These narratives are not abstract. They describe fields burnt, homes ransacked, and lives irrevocably altered. A key engagement that underscored the military effectiveness and chilling independence of these mercenary forces was the Battle of Brignais in 1862. In a remarkable and deeply humiliating defeat for the established powers, a mercenary company decisively routed a royal French army, demonstrating that these companies were not mere disorganized bandits, but formidable military forces in their own right, capable of challenging even the king's authority. This victory further solidified their reputation and ensured their continued, destructive presence. Another formidable, and equally brutal, example emerged from the Mediterranean world: the Catalan Company. Their origins lay with Roger de Flor, a charismatic and ambitious adventurer who formed them to serve the Byzantine Empire, a distant land in need of military might. However, the delicate balance of mercenary service was always precarious, and when de Flor was assassinated under suspicious circumstances, the company, feeling betrayed and cheated, unleashed a campaign of unparalleled plunder and destruction across Greece and the Byzantine territories. This period became grimly known as the Catalan Vengeance, a name that still resonates with the echoes of their ruthlessness when they felt wronged. Crucially, when they were unpaid, they left a trail of desolation and fear, from the Peloponnese to Asia Minor. In a truly remarkable and unsettling turn of events, demonstrating their capacity for more than just fleeting violence and plunder, the Catalan Company eventually managed to carve out their own independent political entities, establishing the Duchy of Athens and Neopatris. This unique outcome highlights the potential for successful mercenary leaders to transcend their initial role and establish lasting, albeit illegitimate, power. Then there were the Swiss Pikemen, whose rise to prominence dramatically altered the face of European warfare. The self-governing Swiss cantons, nestled in their mountainous terrain, developed highly effective pike formations, creating infantry units that were almost unbeatable on the open field against even the most heavily armored cavalry. Their disciplined ranks, armed with long, bristling pikes, presented an impenetrable wall that shattered traditional feudal charges. Victories at battles like Morgarten in 1315 and Sempak in 1386 showcased their unparalleled military prowess and solidified their reputation, making them highly sought-after mercenaries across the continent, from Italy to France. While often operating as disciplined professionals under specific contracts, it is important to note that some Swiss mercenary groups, notably the formidable and often feared black bands, Schwarzguard, also engage in brutal behavior, especially when unpaid or operating far from their home cantons, where the constraints of local reputation held less sway. Their influence on military tactics was immense and transformative, effectively signaling the eventual decline and end of the dominance of heavy cavalry on the battlefield, ushering in an era where disciplined infantry would reign supreme. The German Landsknechts, with their distinctive, often flamboyant attire adorned with slashes and bright colors, and a reputation for a boisterous, often violent, and fiercely independent culture, were another prominent mercenary force that swept across Europe. They were widely employed by the Holy Roman Empire, France, and various other powers, their martial skills eagerly sought after for their aggression and effectiveness. A horrific and indelible illustration of mercenary brutality, and indeed a stark glimpse into the dark side of war itself, was the sack of Rome in 1527. In this devastating event, unpaid Landsknechts, along with Spanish troops, unleashed unimaginable savagery upon the Holy City. They brutally sacked Rome, massacring and pillaging indiscriminately, without regard for age, gender, or allegiance. Churches were desecrated, civilians were slaughtered, and the city's vast treasures were looted. This event served as a stark, indelible reminder of the devastating and uncontrolled consequences when professional soldiers, driven by greed and a lack of accountability, were unleashed without clear command or adequate payment. Even within the context of established royal armies, elements of mercenary activity were prevalent. English and Welsh longbowmen, while often part of the king's forces, frequently served for pay and were renowned for their devastating effectiveness on the battlefield, particularly against French cavalry. Their skill with the longbow made them highly valuable assets. Furthermore, their involvement in chevauchées, lightning raids designed not for conquest but to destroy the enemy's economic base and instill terror, often entailed widespread pillaging and destruction of the countryside, blurring the lines between military strategy and simple rapine. These were soldiers who expected to live, in part, off the land and its people. Beyond these large companies and national groups, individual mercenary captains emerged as truly formidable figures, navigating the brutal business of war with pragmatic skill and often a profound lack of scruple. So John Hawkwood, an Englishman who achieved legendary status operating extensively in Italy during the 14th century, stands out as a quintessential example. Known for his exceptional military skill and strategic acumen, he was equally renowned for his pragmatic approach to allegiances, switching employers frequently based on what was most advantageous and profitable for himself and his company. His long and successful career exemplifies the fluid, transactional, and morally ambiguous nature of mercenary life. Another truly remarkable figure was Francesco Sforza, a prominent condottiero, the Italian term for a mercenary captain, who rose from a humble background, through sheer military prowess and cunning, to become the powerful Duke of Milan. His story, though exceptional, illustrates the rare but potent potential for extraordinary social mobility and significant political power for a truly successful and ruthless mercenary leader in a fractured political landscape. These figures, and the companies they led, were not simply minor players. They were, In many regions, the dominant military and sometimes even political force of their time. The enduring impact of these companies on local populations was concrete, immediate, and tragically profound. History records numerous, harrowing instances of entire villages being virtually wiped out or utterly destroyed by mercenary activity, their populations massacred, scattered, or starved. These were not just abstract numbers or tactical maneuvers in a general's plan. There were individual lives brutally cut short, homes reduced to ash and rubble, and vibrant communities forever scarred, some never to recover. The raw, unfiltered accounts from contemporary chroniclers, such as Jean Froissart and others, consistently echo the deep, widespread suffering caused by these relentless companies, providing chilling, first-hand testimonies to their devastating legacy. These narratives, often compiled in the quiet of a monastery or by a traveling scribe, offer a sobering testament to a time when survival was a daily gamble against forces that recognized no law but their own, and whose shadow stretched far beyond the battlefield, into the deepest recesses of medieval society. The storm of the Black Companies, those fearsome independent military forces that swept across medieval Europe, eventually subsided. The immediate, localized terror they inflicted began to wane as the centuries progressed. Yet, their profound and often brutal impact resonated far beyond the battlefields and the immediate suffering they caused, casting long, transformative shadows into the future and shaping the very nature of warfare, governance, and societal memory in ways that continue to influence us even today. While their specific, medieval form faded with the inexorable rise of modern, centralized states and the development of national armies, the fundamental concepts they embodied, the commodification and privatization of violence, the alluring and corrupting pursuit of profit and conflict, and the chilling, brutal disregard for civilian life, have found disconcerting echoes and unsettling parallels throughout history, persisting with remarkable tenacity even into our complex and often volatile contemporary world. One of the most profound, direct, and ultimately beneficial legacies to emerge from the medieval mercenary scourge was the powerful impetus it provided for the creation of standing armies. Rulers across Europe, from the kings of France and England to the princes of the Holy Roman Empire, utterly exasperated by the inherent unreliability, the exorbitant and often unpredictable costs, and the terrifying, indiscriminate destructiveness of mercenary forces, began to recognize a fundamental and inescapable truth: a kingdom's long-term security, a monarch's legitimate authority, and a state's ability to project power depended entirely on having military forces directly and unequivocally under their own centralized control. The chaotic, often disloyal, and universally feared nature of mercenary companies, with their shifting allegiances and self-serving interests, highlighted the absolute necessity of disciplined, loyal forces whose primary allegiance was to the state, to the crown, and to the emerging concept of the nation, not simply to the highest paymaster. This critical realization, born out of necessity and widespread suffering, gradually but decisively led to the systematic development of national armies, funded directly by the crown, garrisoned in permanent barracks, and commanded by officers loyal to the sovereign. This marked a monumental and irreversible shift away from the decentralized, often inefficient, and part-time feudal system. Over time, these nascent state armies began to professionalize in earnest, with increasing emphasis on standardized training, rigorous discipline, a clear and unbreakable hierarchical command structure, and the establishment of formal military academies to train future generations of officers and soldiers. The anarchy, the widespread devastation, and the unbridled violence wrought by the mercenary bands by exposing their inherent flaws and dangers, thus paradoxically paved the way for more organized, more efficient, and, ostensibly, more accountable military forces, laying the very groundwork for the modern military establishment. However, the fundamental concept of privatized violence, though evolving significantly in form and often cloaked in more sophisticated legal and corporate structures, never truly disappeared from the human landscape. While the specific, rough-and-ready black companies of the medieval period are now confined to the annals of history, their spirit, regrettable as it may be, persists in various modern iterations that reflect a continuous human inclination to outsource military functions. Today, we encounter private military companies and private security companies. These entities, often staffed by highly skilled former military personnel from various national armies, offer a wide spectrum of services, ranging from logistics and training of local forces to armed protection for personnel and infrastructure, and even, controversially, direct combat support in some conflict zones. While they operate within a much more complex, internationally regulated, and, ideally, legally accountable framework than their medieval counterparts, the underlying principle remains disturbingly similar: the provision of military or security services for financial profit by non-state actors. Similarly, the enduring phenomenon of foreign fighters, individuals who, driven by ideology, religious fervor, adventure, or sheer economic desperation, travel to distant conflict zones to participate in wars not directly involving their home nation, continues to be a prominent feature of contemporary conflicts. These individuals echo the medieval mercenary in their willingness to fight for causes or patrons beyond their immediate homeland or national allegiance. These modern parallels, whether corporate or individual, demonstrate the enduring appeal, the inherent dangers, and the complex ethical quandaries posed by privatized violence, underscoring that the drive for profit in conflict and the resulting potential for abuses and lack of accountability is not solely a medieval phenomenon but a recurring challenge to global stability and human rights. The dark side of war, a chilling and omnipresent concept so profoundly and tragically exemplified by the black companies, remains a consistent and deeply troubling feature throughout human history, regardless of the specific military organization, the technological advancements, or the political ideology of the era. This refers to the inherent, almost inescapable potential for brutality, the widespread and often systematic disregard for civilian life, and the rapid descent into lawlessness and moral depravity that all too often accompanies armed conflict. The medieval mercenaries, unbound by strong national loyalties, clear chains of command, or rigorous codes of conduct, laid bare this brutal truth with shocking clarity. Their indiscriminate actions served as a stark, timeless reminder that when the mechanisms of accountability fail, when the rule of law collapses, and when the relentless pursuit of victory or financial profit overshadows fundamental ethical considerations and the basic recognition of human dignity, warfare can quickly devolve into unspeakable atrocities. From the deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure to the widespread practice of sexual violence, the summary execution of non-combatants, and the systematic looting of entire regions, the grim patterns of devastation unleashed by medieval mercenaries find disturbing and recurring echoes in conflicts across the centuries, up to the present day, serving as a powerful testament to the unchanging, darker aspects of human nature under the pressures of war. The legacy of these fearsome companies is also deeply embedded within the rich tapestry of literature and popular culture, reflecting their profound impact on the collective imagination. The rautier, a term often used for a mercenary, brigand, or freebooter during the 100 Years' War, emerged as a recurring and compelling archetype in medieval and later literature. Often portrayed as ruthless, cunning, and morally ambiguous. This figure could also possess a certain grim charisma, a hardened professionalism born of countless battles, or even a twisted, cynical sense of honor. From the pragmatic and often morally compromised mercenary in historical novels like those by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, to the morally complex antihero who lives by his sword in modern fantasy epics, this archetype continues to fascinate and resonate, reflecting the enduring human intrigue with those who live by violence and operate outside the traditional bounds of societal norms and loyalties. This significant and persistent cultural presence speaks volumes about the lasting impression these figures left on the collective consciousness, shaping how we perceive the role of the soldier and the nature of conflict. Moreover, the historical memory of these destructive companies profoundly shaped the consciousness of medieval populations and subsequently influenced later narratives of the period, embedding itself into the very fabric of historical understanding. 4 generations after their main period of activity, the grim stories of their depredations, their unexpected arrivals, and their devastating departures would have been passed down orally, from parent to child, becoming cautionary tales of a time when the world seemed to have turned upside down, when safety was an illusion, and when life was cheap. This collective trauma contributed to a pervasive and deep-seated distrust of foreign or unaffiliated soldiers and a profound, desperate yearning for peace, stability, and reliable protection from central authority. These vivid, often agonizing, memories, in turn, shape how history was recorded, influencing the chroniclers who, in their own time, bore witness to the suffering and often condemned the mercenaries in no uncertain terms. The widespread fear and visceral loathing of these companies, a testament to the profound suffering they caused, cemented their ignominious place in the darker chapters of medieval history, ensuring that their destructive legacy would not be easily forgotten. Now, as the gentle hum of our narrative draws to a close, we reflect on the medieval Black Companies, a crucial and often horrifying chapter in military history. Born out of the changing dynamics of feudal warfare and the harsh realities of economic hardship, these formidable groups of paid soldiers wielded immense destructive power. Their rise was a direct consequence of the limitations of feudal levies and the growing demand for professional, year-round forces. Their operational methods, from systematic scorched earth policies and widespread extortion to the brutal plunder of villages and the horrific violence against civilians, left an indelible mark of economic ruin, social trauma, and profound political instability across the European landscape. The stories of the Tardvenus, the Catalan Company, the Swiss Pikemen, and the German Landsknechts, alongside the pragmatic careers of figures like Sir John Hawkwood, serve as chilling testaments to their devastating effectiveness and their complete disregard for conventional morality. While their excesses ultimately spurred the development of more controlled state armies, signifying a move towards greater order and accountability in military affairs, the fundamental concepts they embodied, the commodification of violence and the potential for rampant brutality when unchecked, regrettably persist in modern forms. Their story serves as a stark, enduring reminder of the brutal reality of mercenary warfare and the inherent, regrettable dark side of human conflict, where profit and power too often overshadowed any regard for human life. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the shadowy, yet profoundly significant, world of the medieval mercenary. May your reflections be calm, and your slumber be peaceful.